Thoth Hermes Podcast. Welcome to the world of the Western Esoteric tradition.
Hello, friends and listeners. Welcome to episode 4 of season 9 of the Thoth Hermes Podcast. My name is Rudolf and I am your host, talking to you here from the outskirts of the lovely Austrian capital of Vienna. And it is my pleasure here on Sunday, October the 9th, to welcome you for this new episode where we are going to speak to David Pantano, and our subject today will be the, not so famous, but he should be much more famous, Italian Hermeticist. And Hermeticist, I think that's the most important of his capacities, of Giuliano Kremmerz. And we will talk about Kremmerz before and after. That's the title of the show. So what led to Kremmerz, what came after him? And we have the right person, David Pantano, to talk to about this. I am very happy that you are here with me on this show, that you have, most of you probably, come back to listen to this episode again. And to those of you who are here for the very first time, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here on the Thoth Hermes Podcast, a podcast that talks now since over 5.5 years about the esoteric tradition, the Western esoteric tradition mainly. I am very happy to have you all here, and if you are new to the show, and also if you're not new to the show, you have several things to do when you go to the website. Go to the website. It's really worth it. thothhermes.com, THOTHERMES.com. So that's thothhermes.com. And there you find all the shows we did so far with the show notes, and that's the important part. The shows you can listen to on many possibilities on YouTube, or you can listen to them on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts and Spreaker, and almost everywhere. But if you want to listen to them and at the same time read the show notes, you should go to the website. It is worth it. And we have many links there also to important pages that will lead you further after having listened to the show. So don't miss out on that. And while you're there, you leave your message. What about that? Send me a message with voicemail, which is on the first page there on the right side. You can always find a label voicemail, and that's free, of course. And you send me voicemail. You can go on Facebook or Twitter. Send me email, info@thothhermes.com. That's an easy way. Or even easier, on the website, you have a contact form from where you can send me messages. Also, if you're on the website, you should go and not miss out the Patreon button. Thank you to all of you who have been already supporters so far of this show. We need all of your support. We have every week over 4,000 listeners, and that's really great. And I don't even dare say how few of them are supporters. I mean, it's unfortunately a bit over the place. It's like that everywhere. But, why should it be different here? So it would be really lovely. We need your support from $1 per show upwards. You are with us. And if you can just afford $1, that's absolutely fine. And if you want to do a one-off donation, that's also possible. So on the website, we have a donation button, we have a Patreon button, or if you want to become a Patreon, you can also go directly on Patreon and look for Thoth Hermes Podcast there, right? So thank you so much. I also wanted to tell you, for those of you who liked to listen to Kaikobad Radio that I had launched and which was running for a few months and which I stopped about 5 or 6 weeks back, there is some hope that it might come on a little bit under different circumstances. I'm at the moment talking to someone about that. Can't tell you more at the moment, but keep your eyes open and your ears open especially. And I will keep you posted about that. It would be great if that came back on again. I'd love that. But, let's not say that too early. Let's put it that way. But let's hope it will work out. So today, of course, Giuliano Kremmerz, already by his name, Giuliano. You see, he is Italian, and we speak about the whole Italic tradition of Hermeticism. You will find out what that is in a moment. And so I thought today's music should be Italian. Of course, Italian music is great. No, I'm not going to play opera again this time. Kremmerz, his main activity also was in the 1920s, and I picked a piece of the 1920s, a 1920s dance music, but very nice, very Italian, very lovely. And I thought we should open with that. It is called Cin-Ci-La, but not written like that furry animal, but Cin-Ci-La. So in the Italian way, Cin-Ci-La, Fox delle Lanterne, so Foxtrot under the lantern, on Box d'Amore. It's really nice. It's very Italian. So it's Cin-Ci-La, Fox delle Lanterne, Box d'Amore. That's the full title of it. A jazz band from 1926. We don't even know the name of the band. A jazz band from 1926 on an original recording with that Fox from Italy. Will open this Italian episode on the Thoth Hermes Podcast. Enjoy. Well, you can clearly hear that American music in the 1920s influenced Europe greatly after that terrible World War I. And, this was really Italian music of 1926. As the whole episode, we're going to play Italian music because we talk about Italy again here today, about the Hermetic physician, as he was named as a title of that book that has been released by Inner Traditions lately, the magical teachings of Giuliano Kremmerz and the fraternity of Miriam. And, that very book, actually, it's already the second that has been released lately by this publisher on Kremmerz or with Kremmerz writings. This book here is actually written by Marco Daffi. Marco Daffi, another Italian, it's a pseudonym. We are going to hear all about that a bit later. Who was a follower and kind of student of Giuliano Kremmerz, but it's a lot of original texts and ideas by Giuliano Kremmerz in there. And David Pantano, who has translated this book, is a great and very, very knowledgeable person on that period, on the whole of Italian Hermeticism, Italian esoteric traditions. And I say Italian to make me understood, but actually he calls it Italic because Italy as a state, as many of you know, will only have existed from the mid-19th century, so to speak. And before it was Roman Empire and a lot of smaller states and church state, etc. So in order to give that a name, it's Italic traditions rather than Italian. We're gonna also discuss this in the episode. Right, and David Pantano compiled those texts, translated them for us, and it's really a wonderful collection. And you're gonna hear it. David, he knows everything about that. He's really great. And I hope to have him back on other subjects because when you talk to him, you can feel he knows a lot more than only, so to speak, about Italic and Italian Hermeticism. He has also recently released another book. Anyway, we are going to hear all of that. I'm going to read you just a few lines from the introduction to that book, the opening notes, translator's preface by David Pantano to give you a little entry in our topic here today. And I am then going directly into the interview. So here is what David Pantano has to say in the opening notes. With the centennial of his earthly passing on the horizon, the memory of Giuliano Kremmerz looks like a shade, casting a luminous silhouette over the landscape of contemporary Hermeticism. But who is Giuliano Kremmerz? What is the fraternity of Miriam? What impact did they have and what influence do they exert on the contemporary Hermetic tradition? These questions and more are the subject of this book. Among his many followers, Giuliano Kremmerz, who lived from 1861 to 1930, is regarded as a master of the Hermetic arts, whose universe of activities gravitated between healer, magus, alchemist, and writer. As an adept, he was reputed to possess magical powers of prodigious proportions, including the ability to separate his inner self from his physical self and navigate the astral plane at will. As an author, he penned over 20 books and numerous treatises on a wide spectrum of subjects devoted to Hermeticism, and his hieratic writings are highly sought after by savants of the royal art. So if that is not enough to make you say, hey, I want to listen to this and, then go on probably in the study of Kremmerz. No, really, he's someone who for various reasons we're also going to discuss has been a bit omitted and now returns onto the scene. And I think it's about time, and we try to help that this happens here today with this interview with David Pantano. You know that I will come back in about, this time it's 37 minutes into the interview. We're going to take another break with a completely different type of Italic music that time. And, for the moment now, let's go to, not Italy, to Toronto, because that's where David lives and works. So David Pantano, and we meet him in Toronto at his place. Let's go there right away.
Here comes the interview.
And today on the Thoth Hermes Podcast, I am happy to meet David Pantano, who is meeting us in his home, Toronto. David, hello. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Rudolph. I look forward to engaging with you and your audience.
Great pleasure, great pleasure. And we have quite an interesting subject here today. Of course, Hermeticists often meet here on the Thoth Hermes Podcast by its name, and we are going to speak about the Hermetic Physician. He, as the new book is called, that was 3 weeks ago released by Inner Traditions, on Giuliano Kremmerz. And it's actually not the first book that they release in the last year or two. They have already released other texts by Kremmerz very recently, and he seems to be in a kind of renaissance on his work and stuff. And it's about time, I think, to talk about him. And who is better placed than you, David, to talk about him? You translated this book, The Hermetic Physician, by the author called Marco Daffi. We get to know all about the background on this and who Marco Daffi was and why you did it, etc. And we are also going to speak about your own book, that because I think before we come to Giuliano Kremmerz, we should see a bit into the background of what you call in your book the magic door, the Italic tradition. But even before that, David, if you want, I would like you to introduce yourself, your personal background, where you come from, what brought you to translate such kind of texts, to write such kind of books, what interests you in the matter, or maybe whatever you want to talk about, what brought you to be the David Pantano that you are today.
Okay, you start with the toughest question because I hate talking about myself. But you've been so kind, we'll make an exception. Yes, I call myself an independent researcher, a historian, a fact finder on a wide array of different topics, but specifically with the Western and Eastern esoteric traditions. My, I guess, introduction to the works of Giuliano Kremmerz was through another Italian author that I'm sure your audience has heard of, called Julius Evola.
Of course,
Evola. Yeah. So let me just rewind us back to when I was a younger lad in the 1980s, and Evola wasn't known in English. I'm based in Toronto in Canada. I'm Canadian of Italian descent, from the Veneto, so not that far. And so I actually came across in the 80s works of Evola en français, because they weren't even published in English. And Evola kept on referencing this Italian magus called Giuliano Kremmerz. I go, that's interesting. First of all, it doesn't sound like an Italian name at all. And then I did some research. Back then, it was going to the libraries and doing some research, and I was able to find which books were in print. They were solely in Italian. So I had to write a letter, a hand letter, and then a fax to the publishing company of Kremmerz's work in Viareggio in Tuscany, and I received his first works, and I was actually blown away, because my background in terms of Hermeticism and that's whole lineage that Kremmerz belonged to was through the works of Renaissance magi like Marsilio Ficino, Giordano Bruno, Pico della Mirandola. And that their Neoplatonic, Hermetic worldview and the erudition, that classical erudition, to me was just a godsend. And that all that seemed to die, that material, that body of work, with the Cartesian revolution in the 1600s, where everything that wasn't empirical based was frowned upon as pseudoscience or of a secondary nature. So a lot of the authors and the material that I like was no longer, it had an expiry date. But little bit been known that there's Giuliano Kremmerz, and the first works that I read of hers, which would have been Il Mondo Segreto, the secret world, was a continuation. It was at that level. And the bonus is that he added a modern scientific and psychological language as correlative to the philosophical branch that was in line with the works of these authors that I was fascinated with from the Renaissance. So there was immediate connection that the writing style, the mannerism, the topics was akin to what my interests were. And so that started, I guess, in the late 80s, my journey to find out more about Kremmerz and the work, and it led to going to a couple of trips to Italy to meeting with people representatives of the fraternity that the esoteric organization that Kremmerz set up over 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's a short introduction to Kremmerz. It was via the works of Evola, who, I guess, through the Hermetic tradition, the introduction to magic, Masque and Visage de Monde Spirituel. There are a number of books that he references Kremmerz and references very highly in terms of acknowledging his erudition and his magisterium of work in the Hermetic and magical fields.
Absolutely. Well, Evola, who has, of course, become a bit infamous lately again, but that's another matter we can speak about at another time.
We'll talk about that another time, yeah.
Exactly.
Bring me back. I'd love to talk about Evola.
Absolutely. No, but the as a matter of fact, it's interesting that you have been brought back to Kremmerz somehow, because Evola quoted him, as you said. So, but he preceded Evola, so Kremmerz was kind of partly influencing, maybe we can speak about that a bit later, but maybe we should, before we go into Kremmerz plainly and into the book that we are going to talk about, go a bit further back in Italian, or Italic, as you call it, even history. And because you wrote that book, The Magic Door, a few years ago. I think it was released 3 or 4 years ago, if I'm not wrong.
2019, I believe, yeah.
Right, yes. And where you developed the whole story of the Italic, which then later became Italian Western tradition, so to speak. We even call it, fun enough, I've never seen that in that terminology, Western inner traditions, right? So you start in a very early age with Aeneas, with Virgil, I believe. Can you maybe give us a rough outline of that book and what the Italic tradition is? We don't want to we don't want to tell all that's in the book, because people should get that book and read it. But maybe you can just tell us a little bit the rough history of Italic tradition.
I'll try and do the 60-second elevator pitch on my book. So
yes.
A book that's like over 250 pages.
Right.
So basically, I think the nucleus of what this Italic esoteric tradition is that there is a vector of a tradition that manifested in the Italic Peninsula in time that preceded history. And what was characteristic and differentiated this tradition is that it talked about not of a country, but of a whole continent called Hesperia. And Hesperia is the Western star. It's a Venus at dawn, and a Venus at the hour of Vespers, when the sun is setting. And it talks of these Western lands, and it's associated with other type of archetypes and other type of mythologies associated with Arcadia. So this place of this Saturnia Tellus, of this primordial land where people lived in peace and heroes were begotten from this land, and that is sort of like the humus, the terrain from which to look at from this tradition is that it's a very much a Western tradition, so it's not nationalistic based. It took root in the Italic Peninsula, and before there was things as nation states and so forth, and there was specific physiognomy, specific metaphysical components associated with this new type of man that at this point, and I reference some authors such as Evola and Bachofen, who talk about the new type of man that in the ancient world, specifically in the ancient Mediterranean world, where they took on more of a solar type of an orientation rather than the lunar, without denigrating the lunar, because the mother traditions are very important. But there were a number of different metaphysical components that formed this tradition, and one of them is contained within the name of Rome, Roma, Amor, Mora, and Amor. So there's a mystery associated with that there were two sides. So the one is Maro, Mars, and the other is Amor, Venus, and the balancing of the male and the female, the solar and the lunar, as part of this tradition. So it's separated back then, I guess the Mediterranean was very much in the Western world, wasn't existent. There wasn't a physiognomy. There wasn't a tradition. There were sparks of light that were starting to develop, and one that took root, and which eventually manifested in the physical sense as the empire, or the occult imperium, was a Roman Empire based on some of these metaphysical principles that I referenced to. And again, I don't want to go too deep into it because we would only be talking about this at that point. But that to me is the essence of this Italic tradition, is rooted in this vision of the West as a Hesperia, under the guidance of the star of love, of love as the transforming principle and force. And Dante refers it to in his canticles, his last canticle, where love is what turns the stars in the universe. Mm-hmm. So it's a theme, and you have the poets of love, the Dulce Stil Nova poets. You had the Roman poets of Virgil and Ovid, who talk about these type of traditions, and so there's that common thread that is associated both in the pre-Italian, in the Roman, even in the pre-Roman, as the egregore, the metaphysics, and that feeds into the very trajectory that took root in the physical or the phenomenal plane, as well as in the mental and the spiritual plane.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I have, as I told you before we started the show, I have not completely read that book yet, but I have read big chunks of it, and I can only tell people, well, do get that book. It's really an interesting one. I was also fascinated to read about Cagliostro, because I hadn't seen him, for example, the Egyptian rite that you mentioned in that book, also in that lineage, so to speak. I saw it. I know the subject quite well, but I had not previously wouldn't have put him into that lineage, and it was interesting to me to see how you did that.
There's very much a connection between Cagliostro and Kremmerz, the school from which they both developed. This Neapolitan Egyptian school that had its roots with the excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the earlier part of the century by Raimondo da Sangro, who is sort of the father of the modern Egyptian Neapolitan Hermetic tradition. And from it, the various branches of Egyptian Rite Freemasonry that you talked about, not only Cagliostro's Egyptian Rite, but the rites of Mizraim and of Memphis, and then the Miriam is a offshoot of that as well. Different than Masonic, but it's connected with it. And the Egyptian order, which was founded by Raimondo da Sangro, is the order that oversees the Miriam, the fraternity, the Isaic fraternity that Kremmerz set up in the 1890s.
That still exists today.
In various forms, yes.
Yeah,
various forms.
Yeah. Is that an Egyptian school which was based also in Naples, or was that the one that then moved later on to Venice?
So the school originally started with Raimondo de Sangro, and in the 1730s. So he founded this order. He founded this order called the Rosa d'Ordine de Magno, which is an anagram of his name, and they were 12 masters, and from this nucleus of elect adepts, there were various branches that went into Scottish Freemason, Scottish Rite, an Egyptian Rite that came up. Originally was the Mizraim that went into Venice, and then in the 1800s, I think in France was the first development of the Memphis Rite, and then Garibaldi after the unification of Italy, he combined the Memphis and the Mizraim into one rite. But there are all other types of rites as well. And then Cagliostro, who formed his own theurgical rite with 3 degrees, went to the same school in Naples. And his master was a part of the Egyptian order, the 12 that we talked about. So that was founded by this Prince Raimondo de Sangro.
Right, interesting.
And also Henri Choudy as well in the Glorious Star as well. So there are various offshoots of this Egyptian order.
And the Egyptian Freemasonry is a topic for me, at least 2 other shows, of course. It gets so
we
complicated.
got a lot to talk about.
Absolutely, it's very complicated in the 19th century, especially. But now let's talk about that. I was interested in that link between the Cagliostro, Naples school, and bringing that into Kremmerz. Before we do that, maybe you should tell people who Giuliano Kremmerz was, because we have now mentioned his name often, but as I said, even among well-versed Hermeticists, his name is still some kind of, well, maybe not unknown, but people don't know much about him. So tell us a bit about him.
That's a fair statement to make. Kremmerz is probably the leading Hermeticist in the contemporary Italian tradition. He's probably considered the preeminent one in the sense of he had both his skills in terms of practical, operational Hermeticism and theoretical in terms of writing, or of a level that's not achieved by anyone else in the contemporary Italian tradition of Hermeticism. The school that he founded, called the Fraternity of Miriam, the Therapeutic Magical Fraternity of Miriam, was an Isaic school. So based on developing lunar powers rather than the solar or Osirian powers, which is a deeper level. And Kremmerz was, as I mentioned earlier, is from the region of Naples, specifically a town called Portici. And that the Neapolitan school, as referred to earlier, was the nucleus of this Egyptian-based Hermetic thread. And the association was that there was an Iseum in classical Roman times at Pozzuoli, that's close by to Naples, that with the famous volcano of Vesuvius was buried. And in the excavations that occurred in the 16s and 1700s, and a lot of it was under the tutelage of Prince Raimondo de Sangro, there was this Iseum that was uncovered, and from them there were certain manuscripts and so forth that were uncovered, and they became part of the archive. That's the the word on the street anyways.
So Iseum being a temple of Isis, basically, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
A practicing temple of Isis back in classical Roman times. So we're talking around, 50 BC till the eruption, which is, I think, in 70 CE, AD. So the last pontifex of this Iseum was called Mamo Rosar Amru, who is the egregore of this tradition.
Right.
And so Kremmerz was at a young age in his house. He came from modest background, from his father and mother were modest. And in his house there was an initiate called Izar bin Eskur, who was part of the Egyptian order, and he was known for being very strong in therapeutics, thaumaturgy, and astrology, and as well as alchemy. So Kremmerz at a young age was brought up or tutelized by this master occultist named Izar, and he, as a young man, he went to France, apparently to some of the Martinist schools and to some of the mesmerist and magnetic schools to develop skills, and he was initiated into the teachings of this Hermeticism.
We are talking early 19th century here, right? When
we're talking we're talking about late 1880. So Kremmerz, to give you some timelines, was born 1861 and died in 1930.
Exactly.
So his first 25 years is not much known, but his schooling, his profession was, I think he was as a teacher, historian, and then he went to, in the late 1880s, early 1890s, he went to South America, where he lived a very adventurous life, and part of that he received a degree in medicine and in normal type of medicines, if we want to use that term.
School medicine, what we call it today, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. So he had both the school-based medicine as well as the more internal therapeutic medicine. And at that time in the 1890s, when he returned from Argentina and other Latin American countries, he met up with his mentor, his master, Izar, and there was a cholera pandemic that was just ending in Naples. So not too dissimilar to the pandemic that supposedly ended in the Western world this year. And Kremmerz was saying to his master that to help out because the decimation of the population, and specifically those who were of a poor background and a lower social economic background, was just immense. So he wanted to develop an order that would focus on developing not only individual but collective psychic powers, where the application would be for healing, for therapeutics. And then Kremmerz said the reason why he chose us was it was the vehicle that was less suited to developing egotism and self-aggrandization. So there was a selfless, benign component behind it. So he started this school in the middle 1890s, around the same time that he started publishing his first work called Il Mondo Secreto, The Secret World, which led him into trouble because with the local Egyptian order that we talked about, this 12 members that oversaw the various Egyptian esoteric groups, they felt that Kremmerz was feeding pearls to the pigs, that he was giving this information out to those who weren't worthy of receiving it. They were very much a conservative and a hierarchical worldview from this from the Egyptian order, the members of the Egyptian order. So that set the ball rolling in the 1890s, and Kremmerz wrote around 20 different texts and a number of articles on a vast array topics on Hermeticism, from divination to theurgy to practical medicine, to Hermetic medicine, to divine and practical and natural magic, on the tarot. He wrote very much on the art of love as well. So it's an inner alchemy, and he as well. He was leading this fraternity, of red robed monks, of Hermetic monks called the Miriam, and he also had a school called the Schola Philosophica Italica, which was sort of like a library of different works of this tradition that members or aspirants to being part of this tradition could read up on and become familiar with the doctrinal components of this Italic branch of Hermeticism.
And interestingly, as you just said, the book was not called Schola Filosofica Italiana, but Italica. He still, even though at the time, I believe already the unification of the Kingdom of Italy had happened, exactly. He was still using the ancient term Italica, so wanting to link it back to historical times, right?
Yeah, and fair to say, it wasn't just for show. The Kremmerz always said that the school that he wanted to found wasn't to be a mystical school, that it was to be on a Pythagorean base. So very much, very much positivistic, in the sense that it's one thing to show, to write about these wonderful theories, but you have to be able to practice and produce them. And that's one of the components of this Italic tradition. It goes back to Giambattista Vico, who's another Neapolitan philosopher who challenged Descartes. And Descartes says that, the truth is based on what can be empirically verified. Whereas Vico said that's very much a lunar type of epistema, that only what your physical senses, the five senses, can perceive is what truth. What the real litmus test of truth is what you can create, and creation comes from inside. And then he cites the Pythagoreans and the other branches of classical literature as examples of it, from which to feed into this current. So it's very much more than just a historical connection. It was the look at the source of inspiration to the classical times, to some of these authors and the works that preceded them, that from the mystery school. So even the medical or the Hermetic teachings of medicine, of thaumaturgy, had their components in the Egyptian and the Asclepian schools of the mystery traditions of ancient Greece, where they would use various dream therapies and other types of spiritual means as a support to some of the physical interventions to help afflicted individuals to relieve of pain and eventually to recover. Also, possible.
those therapies where people went into caves, I believe, into the dark for some time, and that which was done in parts of Greece, but based on Egyptian knowledge, they said, right?
Yes, very much the Asclepian schools were based on some of the EHOP of medicine schools that were developed and advanced in Egypt, in pre-Hellenistic Egypt as well, Pharaonic Egypt, yes.
Yeah. And what the Egyptian group now back in Naples, what they felt offended by Kremmerz probably was the fact that he didn't want his Hermeticism to be very arcane, but rather for at least helping the people, maybe not for the people that would be exaggerated, but at least open to the people, right?
Yeah. So the Egyptian order were very, as I mentioned, very conservative and reserved. They were members of the nobility, very rich people, and Kremmerz was basically if you read the statutes, which is included in the book, of the Miriam for the novices. I mean, his intentions were to develop Hermetic medicine clinics throughout Italy and eventually throughout Europe. So it was very much opening up these esoteric practices to a broader audience. And that, of course, didn't sit well with the more conservative elements and hierarchical elements of the Egyptian order. So there was some, Kremmerz did receive some flack, and there even some people suggest it was the reason why he first moved from Naples to Bari, and from Bari to Beausoleil in the French Monaco.
Monaco, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's where he also died in the end, I believe, right?
Exactly. He died in 1930 in May in Beausoleil, in Monaco.
Yeah. But I mean, we're speaking here, as you said, late 19th century, which was also elsewhere the time where we call the time the famous occult revival. So in France, in England, etc. Was Kremmerz, in your view, part of that occult revival, but in the Italian way, or was he a complete separate movement from that, which happened at the same time but did not have any relation?
That's a really great question. That's a great question, Rudolph. I would say that it's a bit of both. So, as I mentioned earlier, Kremmerz, in his as a younger lad, did go to south of France to learn some of the techniques of mesmerism and magnetism, and that's certainly a component of the healing that the Miriam produces in their rituals and their applications. As well, he participated in a number of spiritual seances. There's a famous Neapolitan spiritist called Giuseppe Palladino, and he participated in these various spiritualist, mediumistic seances, but he went away disappointed. And he said to his master Izar, is that, people come here to be entertained, not to be transformed. They leave as ignorant as they first came, and they just want their senses to be excited. So he wanted a school where individuals could develop their own powers and faculties, but also create this collective energy, this reservoir of benign energy to use and to help those who needed relief in whatever manner the affliction that they had. So he wanted to go further than the practices of the time, which were based on Christian Science with the seances and mediums and magnetisms. He took from those practices the best part of it in terms of how to enter into your magical space. But he also was based on some of these Italic traditions, some of those Neoplatonic and Hermetic strands of inner alchemy, to be able to use some of these native type of practices and combine it with the more modern esoteric and occult practices of the day.
Right. You just mentioned Christianity and Christian backgrounds, of course, which were, especially in France, an important part of at least some of those, like Péladan, those people at the time. But
exactly.
Italy being a very Catholic country by definition, was Kremmerz influenced by Catholicism, or was he rather the Hermeticist, as we know many of them today, who would be, well, a generalist when speaking about spirituality? Or what was his background in that?
I mean, that's always a very difficult question, because he doesn't come out and identify his religious his beliefs and so forth. Mm-hmm. He lived very much within the context of the people in the country that he was with. There were a number of members specifically of this Egyptian Hermetic tradition that were influenced by pagan ideas and so on and so forth. And for Kremmerz, my reading of his material, he looked at the spirituality manifests itself in various contexts and over time and over geographic and various ethnic contexts as well. So his writings includes references to not only to Hermes and Mercury, but also to various Christian examples. It's more understanding the philosophy, the forces, the spiritual component, understanding those roots rather than their actual manifested, which is contextualized in the relativity of the day and of the time. Mm-hmm. I could also say that that his work in itself certainly would have been influenced by the various religious confraternities that were around that time, that had various prayer sessions that would intersect on those who were sick or those who were dying. So there's a lot of the physiognomy in terms of the rituals, the wearing, the fasting, those type of things that certainly could have that type of connotation. But also, again, I talked about earlier these archive of books that tend to go back to Babylonian times, Chaldean times, and even Egyptian times. So Izar had this famous astrological calendar based on the Chaldean and the Egyptian calendars. One was a solar base, the other was lunar, to do various types of rituals for healing based on the season and the time. And there's this book that's published called the Lunations, the Lunazioni, that take elements not only from ancient times of the Babylonians and Egyptians, but also has medieval components as well, Paracelsus, exactly. So it wasn't very much exclusive of anything, and it just mentioned that if a member wanted to be part of the Miriam, to leave their dogmas behind, because this was supposed to be a scientific and empirical based type of order where your development needs to be validated in more manners than just on the belief system. Mm-hmm. And Kremmerz always says, don't take anything that's said here by its word. You need to be able to validate it with yourself.
And now let's take our musical break as usual in the middle of the interview. And as I promised, it's going to be music from the country that is now called Italy, but is actually music from Roman times, ancient Roman music. Pugnate, it's called the piece by a group. The group is called Pugnate, sorry. They just call the track Musica Romana, because it's a kind of mix of different types of music, but which they say is being performed in the way it was done at ancient Roman times. And as we have been talking about ancient Rome before, I think it would be a good fit, wouldn't it? Okay, but a little bit unusual here today to have this music, but we always like unusual things in this podcast, don't we? Great, then, so let's listen to that. And after the ancient Roman music, we return to David Pantano and speak further on about Kremmerz and what comes after him, and all further topics on that very interesting person, with a very interesting person to speak to about it, David Pantano. At the end of the interview, we have, that needs to be Napolitanian, of course, with all that we're talking about. Tarantella, like it should be in the good old style, Tarantella Napoletana. Just called like that. It's called Tarantella Napoletana. Solo Musica, okay? So, looking forward to that as well. And after the Tarantella, I come back. No, I'm not going to dance the Tarantella. I'm just going to sit there and tell you who will be our guest next week. And so I am now going to leave the stage for the ancient Roman music, after which we, David Pantano and I, return for the second part of the interview, and then the Napolitanians will play us a Tarantella. Okay, go and enjoy. What I find interesting, among other things, of course, is that, at least to my knowledge, we find here, and maybe we can speak a bit more in depth about that fraternity of Miriam, we find here a healing procedure based on Hermeticism, on Egyptian Hermeticism, whereas in Western traditions, when we speak about healing, it's mostly Rosicrucianism which comes to mind, right? Am I right that this Hermetic approach is quite singular in the history, at least of the last few centuries of Hermeticism, or am I just reading I
agree with you, Rudolph. That was my impression as well when I first read this material. Most of the esoteric material is very heavily based on Hebraic, Judaic type of rituality, specifically like the Golden Dawn. Whereas the Miriam, the Kremmerz school, there's a much more of a Neoplatonic, Greco-Egyptian, Italic components to it. The references, one of the erudition of some of these members that I'm talking about, they had a classical knowledge that's just uncommon these days. They classical knowledge in the sense that they can quote Dante and Ovid and Virgil and Homer and a number of the works that they talk about is based on that level of erudition. So it's very much what I call a sui generis type of tradition that, as the egregore says, it was brought to Italy through migrants from Egyptians, and they formed this Iseum and just outside of Pompeii. Mm-hmm. And from that, there was a number of practices, including healing, which formed the egregore that the Miriam would revive 20 centuries later, or maybe 19 centuries later.
Is the Miriam, the fraternity of Miriam, would you call it an order? Does it follow initiations by grades like other societies of the time, or what?
Yeah, you could say it's an order. It has 5 grades, from the novice to the master Miriam, and there's also the therapeutic Miriam that have to show a record that they were involved in healing individuals, and to be able to document that. So it's very much, and I mentioned earlier, it's an Isaic, so it's very much a lunar. It's based on one's own inner skills and inner qualities. But for those few who are able to reach the master level, some are initiated into the Osirian level. So there is this also another order called the Osirian Rite, that Osirian Egyptian Rite, that has more solar-based rituals and practices.
And also founded by Kremmerz at the time.
So there are a number of different solar, what Kremmerz called Ammonian rites. Ammonian referring to Capricorn, the constellation of Capricorn, which is conducive for the soul to exit from this world into a higher plane. There are a number of different Osirian orders. Some are, over time, they were under the purview of this Egyptian orders. Kremmerz had his own Osirian Egyptian order, which was a step up from the Miriam. It's difficult to see how it fit into this broader context of Egyptian orders, just because a lot of this material isn't available and there's a lot of conjecture involved. So it's difficult to sort out fact from fiction. But there are a number of different Egyptian orders, there are a number of different Osirian orders and solar orders that pertain to this period.
Right. Kremmerz, you said that a little bit earlier, and now we're coming also to another name, Marco Daffi, who of course was writing parts of the text that you translated for that book, The Hermetic Physician, that we are also talking about here. Kremmerz is, I think his original name was quite different. He sounded much more Italian, his birth name, right? Yeah, it was
Ciro Formisano.
Exactly, and some people spell Kremmerz Kremmerz with a hyphen between those letters. Can you tell us what it means? How did that name come together, and why?
Kremmerz?
Yes.
Well, Kremmerz, it's a magical name. So Krem is from one of the Jennies from the Sharon-Faresh, and Ertz is a suffix associated with that. Mm-hmm. And Daffy actually in the next book that I write talks about that, translates that in terms of the what the occult meaning of Kremmerz is.
Okay.
So it's representative of his Jenny, that of his magical self.
Right.
Marco Daffi was initially I guess you would say, a student of Kremmerz, even though he himself wasn't part of the Miriam. When Daffi is a pseudonym for the biographical name of the individual was called Baron Ricciardo Ricciardelli, who came from a very rich Neapolitan family with terrains throughout central and southern Italy. And he was in contact through member of the Roman fraternity called the Accademia Virgiliana, the Virgil Academy, in 1926. And he met Kremmerz in 27, and Kremmerz recognized that this was a man of a very emancipated soul, of an inner development. And they, over a 3-year time, they had a number of correspondence. And from that, it was the impetus for Daffy to develop his own trajectory in this tradition. And Kremmerz, apparently Kremmerz put Daffy in touch with the Egyptian order. The Egyptian order by this time was led by a prince, Leone Caetani, who was anti-fascist. So we're talking the periods in the late 20s, early 30s, and he moved to Canada. And Daffy had a correspondence with Caetani, and also received some of the inner practices of the Egyptian order to help with his development and some of his healings that Daffy was involved with him. And Daffy, as some people say, after Kremmerz, was the initiate of that level, of a master level, and he wrote about 10 to 15 books and articles. Most of them that weren't published in his lifetime. Most of them were published after Daffy died. Daffy died in 1960. He was born in 1900. And Daffy was more focused on the Pythagorean anonymus, that is recollection of past lives. And he was known for having psychic abilities. Daffy was the head of was a guest speaker of the Accademia Tiberina, which is a famous intellectual academy. Goes back 100 years, based in Rome, where he would give talks on all aspects of esoteric world, such as with divination, manticism, on alchemy, even on spiritual traditions of the East and the West. So he had a very broad knowledge, and a very interesting writer that I'm starting to publish and to translate more of his work, so it can be recognized and it can be read by those who are interested in this branch of the Hermetic tradition.
Was Daffy, and I believe his name was, the pseudonym was also kind of a Egyptian derived. I read somewhere Mofkohek Daf was kind of.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier,
Daffy, right?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, Rudolph. So Daffy was Daffy was provided a number of practices from the Egyptian order. Daffy felt he was missing something. He went a period of crisis in the 20s. He was introduced to Kremmerz, where he felt there was something missing in his personality. He wasn't able. He was feeling incomplete, and the conversation between Daffy and Kremmerz, it was revealed. This was from one of Daffy's intuitions or developments, that he was an incomplete avatar. Okay. Which meant he had very high certain intellectual components, but he was missing his third body. So in this tradition, they base it on that each organic being has 4 bodies: a solar, a mercurial, a lunar, and a Saturnian. And that Daffy was an adept, or realized, in 3 of those bodies. He was missing his lunar body. Okay. So he was, and Kremmerz congratulated Daffy for this intuition, for coming up with that, because it was part of there was a conjecture in terms of how to identify what was the missing component. So after Kremmerz died, Daffy continued his correspondence with the Egyptian order based out of Canada with Prince Caetani, where he had a number of practices, and some of these practices was part of a past life regression. And part of his past life, Daffy realized that he was a Phoenician sacerdote who was working at one of the temples of an Egyptian pharaoh, and there was some incidents that were involved, that a curse was put on him. Okay. So that, I'll just leave that the little bit of tidbit. But apparently Daffy would go into these almost seizure-like contortions, where he would have these past life reflections come out, and he would take on a different voice, and his appearance would change. And much of his writings were based as this sacerdote called Morko Heddaf, which is a Phoenician sacerdote. So that's Yeah, so that's the storyline behind the pseudonym that he was using, which really isn't a pseudonym, which is what he referred to as his Aeonic name.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very interesting. How much Kremmerz is in Duffy? I mean, they only met for 3 or 4 years, as you said. When he writes about the fraternity of Miriam and Kremmerz, how much is there Kremmerz in Duffy?
I would say Daffy always referred to Kremmerz as a mentor. So he never, he also criticized Kremmerz as well. So there are some points of criticism in terms of doctrine and practice that Daffy had disagreements with. And that's fine. And Kremmerz always said, don't take my word or don't take anybody's word. You need to validate things himself. But it's always a constant reference point. Specifically in this Italic tradition, you have Dante taking Virgil to get, as his mentor, to get out of Inferno to go into Purgatory, and from Purgatory as a stepping stone to a Paradiso. And I look at Kremmerz, the relationship between Kremmerz and Daffy is similar to what Dante's was with Virgil, is that he's what got them there. He's the basis, the foundation, but Daffy goes further. Just like Dante went further than what Virgil wrote. Virgil wrote in his 4th book of the Eclogues about, about a catharsis and so on and so forth. And it's sort of the impetus to Dante's being in the midlife crisis in the dark forest where, he enters this place that is all dark and he doesn't know where he is. He's scared, but a light appears and a voice comes to him. He says, "Who are you?" He says, "No one asks me who I am. Who are you? That's why you're here."
Right.
So it's a similar scenario. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And so he really refers back to the early Italic tradition, right? And specifically to Kremmerz. So Kremmerz is his reference point throughout much of his work.
Very, very, very interesting. This show is called Kremmerz Before and After. So before, of course, because we talked a lot about leading to him and what was his inspiration and his tradition, so to speak. Would you call Kremmerz being somebody, maybe if it's a bit predated to call him that, as a traditionalist, or is he completely different from that current of Guénon and the likes? Is he diverse from that?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. The only mention that Kremmerz has of Guénon is Kremmerz did a review of a couple of Guénon's works in the early 20s, I think on the Theosophism and on contemporary spiritualism, where Kremmerz praises Guénon for his erudition and his very tight arguments. However, he says he makes out of tradition another religion. That's what he condemns. He actually puts forth, and so Kremmerz says in terms of Hermeticism, it's not about dogma. It's not about my philosophy is better than yours. It's a very much an organic, which means the truth grows, and it needs to be validated. And those who take a dogmatic approach, much like some have referred to Guénon, are not Hermetic. So that was his major contention. So to answer your question, I would say not in the sense of the Guénonian canon of traditionalism, closer to perhaps to what Evola was. And Evola is like a heretic for some people in traditionalism because he did, he took major issues with the master. But it's so the tradition that Kremmerz follows is of a alchemical Hermetic tradition, right? Specifically of that Italic branch that we've talked about earlier,
which probably inspired him also to be more open and less arcane than traditionalists were, right? And I see what you mean. And where does he lead? I mean, we spoke about Duffy now, who was the kind of, he was the mentor for Duffy, and he went on Duffy. But what came after Kremmerz, why do you think has he kind of, in our minds, disappeared and is now coming back finally? But what happened between his 1930s and well, those last 90 years, right?
So that's a good question. So the Miriam was always a reserve society. Again, it wasn't about money. It wasn't about power and publicity and so forth. It was really about setting a really serious order to practice Pythagorean, these Pythagorean practices. And Pythagoreanism had two components. It had the empirical, where we associate with mathematics and building, but it also had a spiritual, as like I talked about earlier, the amnesis of going inside yourself to get outside of yourself. So that was his goal, and it wasn't about building the biggest or this empire. That being said, after Kremmerz's passing in 1930, the Miriam itself, it went underground because of the fascism was very much anti-Masonic, anti-occultist. But the practices continued in various chapters in small circles and in individuals. After the Second World War, a number of these different chapters came up, and then similar to what you find in Masonic world, there was a bunch of different people leaderships who are claiming that they are the sole inheritors of Kremmerz, and others denouncing others. And then I think just a few years, or maybe 20 years ago, this one organization that's based out of Naples actually went to court. And they have the legal right to call themselves the Orthodox school of the Fraternity of Miriam and the Scuola Hermetica Italica Classica. But there are other branches that call themselves, Kremmerzian Academy, and call themselves Miriam with a Y, others with an I. And to me, that's less interesting as the philosophy and the practice itself. To me, is where the value and the richness in terms of the human side and the personality side. To me, that's less interesting. Even though I did, in my 30, 40 years, did meet with a number of different representatives, and they're interesting characters, as most people in the esoteric world are. So, but I think the doctrine and the philosophy, to ask why it's seeing a resurgence, is because it's of that level that it can provide for many people who are searching for an authentic tradition that can open their eyes and provide them with answers to questions that they can't get elsewhere.
Yeah, those legal issues about naming of traditions, we have had that in Golden Dawn, we have had that in Rosicrucianism. It's amazing. If somebody who is interested in the Fraternity of Miriam and those teachings, apart from reading the book that we are talking here, The Hermetic Physician, if in practice they would like to look that up or meet or find teaching, where would you nowadays send them to? Can you say that, or is that tricky?
That is tricky. I would say, first of all, I'm a researcher, so I'm at arm's length. And I think it's a good practice is not to get enamored with any individuals or any organization. Always go with an open mind and always have your independence as paramount. But those who want to get, it's not difficult to go online. You can do some searches. If you can read Italian, it's probably a good place to start. There are a number of different books that are published that from Kremmerz, and from the quality of that, you can get a sense of the organization that's behind it. So, it's not that I'm sure there's a broad section of those who are less credible versus those who are credible. And I would, if somebody asked me for a reference, I would provide what I've just said. If they really press me for some names, I would have to do some further research, because I'd be wary in terms of, misdirecting people down the wrong path. And that's for any esoteric organization. to me, again, the material, the philosophy, the practices can stand the test of time, and that what the individual can, in terms of studying and learning about, is to me a benefit, especially if you have a great love for the type of material that is a wisdom tradition that you found in the Renaissance and of the classical world as well. If that really resonates with you, then this is a really good tradition or branch to follow up on.
And if you want to do that now as a solitaire, I'm not talking about entering a group or so. If you want to learn and also practice that tradition, where do you start with then?
Well, in my book, I include two rituals: the Aries ritual and the spring ritual from Kremmerz's first journal, the book, volume 2 of Il Mondo Secondo, the Mondo Secreto. Mm-hmm. And that gives you a sense of the various components of it. There's a daily ritual, there are talismans, there are various fasting and so forth. As well, on the in the book, The Hermetic Physician, there are the guidelines of the order itself. So you get a sense of what is the scope of this fraternity of Miriam. And from that, it's a question of purification. Mm-hmm. Is that you're able to use these practices as a means to go through those 3 levels of inner transformation: the black, the white, and the red. And it's, to the individual seeker could benefit from that, because there are practices and guidelines that can help the seeker in each of those phases. But that's beyond the scope. That's beyond the scope of this book. But there's a wealth of knowledge that one can find if they know what they're looking for.
Right. So Kremmerz seems to be appearing back on stage, so to speak, also in English language now, peu à peu, to speak English. I've also mentioned the book by Inner Traditions that was published earlier, The Hermetic Science of Transformation, which are, I believe, also texts by Giuliano Kremmerz that have been published in English for the first time about a year or 2 years ago. 3 years ago, in November 2019 already. Time is flying by. And this book now, The Hermetic Physician, that you translated, are there other things coming up, texts by Kremmerz that we should be able to look at?
For sure. On The Hermetic Physician, you can read a biography on Kremmerz. You can read the histography of the Order of Miriam. You can read about the various Hermetic healing practices that were put in place. It goes in quite detail. It's not very vague. It actually specifies the 3 types of healing: a direct, indirect, and neutral healing. Mm-hmm. It talks about the various bodies that we talked, the Hermetic bodies that constitute the individual, and understanding how to assess ailments based on karmic issues, as well as the various the cosmic context that one finds himself in. So it goes quite detailed, not only in the surface areas, but also digs deep into the doctrinal and practices. Also, we've included, as I mentioned, a number of direct writings from Kremmerz itself on the guidelines of the order, the Practica Fundamentale, the fundamental program. We included as well on 2 rituals that the novices or aspirants were used to enter into the Miriam. So it's a pretty full picture of profile of who Kremmerz is, of the Miriam, the type of practices, and goes into detail in terms of some of the rituals and the paraphernalia associated with that, fasting and the various conjunctions of lunar and celestial components.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating to speak to a person like you who is so well versed and like almost an encyclopedia of the time and period on Kremmerz, but not only him. That's the fascinating part, all the background.
35 years, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm working on a next book.
I was going to ask you, I hope you're doing something else with that.
Yeah. So next book that I finished the manuscript, and I've sent it off, is on the works of Marco Daffi, which is going to be very interesting. They're much more in the inner alchemical component. And there'll also be a biographical, and he was known for being part of a famous trial called the Trial of the Magus. So we're going to include selections from that as well, and a summary of the various works and books that go under the name of Marco Daffi. So it's going to be another really good cross-section of both doctrine and practices. It's going to go much more deeper, though, into the aeonic components of individuals and talking about the bodies of glory and the various means to separate the lunar self from the physical self. So it's something to look forward to.
That sounds great, but we don't have a date for that yet, or something like that.
No, not yet. I actually just finished it over the weekend. It's something like over 100,000 words or so, 120,000, something like that.
So, guys, this is brand new news, breaking news, so to speak. A book on Marco Daffi on the horizon. Let's hope it will appear in this world soon. Well, David, this was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure our listeners did so as well. Thank you for being with us here. And I just hope that we will have the chance to have you back on the show at some point that maybe speak about some other of the topics, because when I speak to you, I realize that there are many, many things we could talk about, and it would be just as erudite as you are on Daffi and Kremmerz and the Italic tradition.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. And maybe you have a final word for our audience, what they should be on the lookout, or what's your impression on the development on Kremmerz, or anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, I think for the audience, the reader who's looking for something deeper than what you commonly find in your esoteric or new age type of reading material, that you would value a lot from Kremmerz. He's the type of author that you go back multiple times and you pick up different components, because it's very nuanced. As I mentioned, he comes from a time and a place where classical knowledge and erudition was much more advanced than it is today. So the reference material is really fascinating. He writes in a very Kabbalistic way, in the sense it's very much based on a mythopoetic type of reference material. But also he combines it with a strong scientific and psychological rationale or logos. So it's very unusual. It's very difficult to define, to pigeonhole him, because he's very much a one of a kind. And his material itself is difficult to translate because of that. It's difficult to capture all the nuances. But hopefully that a reader who picks it up will be able to be enticed by this and want to find out more information. And if any of your listeners would want to be in contact with me, I'm on Facebook or Instagram. Or you could even write to the publisher. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have on the Hermetic Physician or my other book, The Magic Door.
Great. And as usual, we will have your links to your pages and all of that on the website of Thoth Hermes for the show notes. And of course, as I often do when people want to contact authors, they write to info@thothhermes.com, and I'll hand it over to you. If you want to answer, you can do it then right away. So that's also a possibility. Happy to help.
Great.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your time, and good luck with all your plans. And it was great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Rudolph. You take care.
Tarantella Napoletana, what a lovely music, don't you think so? I think it was worth playing that here today. All Italian music, starting with the 1926 jazz band from Italy, then ancient Roman music, and now Tarantella from Napoli. And in between all that, a wonderful interview with David Pantano about Giuliano Kremmerz, a great Italian hermeticist, which you all should discover. It is about time that he will be better known on the stage of Hermeticism. And it was also very interesting to hear about David's book, about what happened before all that and his opinion on what came afterwards. And as you hear, there will be hopefully sequels to what we just heard with the publishing house, but also hopefully with us here and David. Thank you, David, for being with us. Thank you all for listening. It was great to have you. And, well, thank you for coming back next week. Well, I'm sure you're going to come back next week, because next week will be the return of somebody I really like to have here on the show for the third time, actually. Mark Stavish is back. He was already here once this year even, but it's always so interesting to talk to him. And a little bit as a follow-up on what we started touching here today, we're going to be talking about traditionalism, etc. And I know that it will be very interesting to hear Mark Stavish discuss things with me on that. So, yes, well, I think that's about it for today, isn't it? We've had the announcement for next week. We've had a wonderful interview before that. We had lovely music, and I had lovely guests, both David and you all who were with me listening on this show. Thank you once again, and take care. Stay tuned. Hear you soon.